All right, welcome to the Gateway API meeting. It is April 8th, 2024, and got a few things on the agenda, but most everything is focused on the 1.1 release. Um, if you have anything else you'd like to talk about, don't hesitate to add it to chat, drop it into the agenda. Do want these meetings to be as open-ended and free form as possible. So here's a link to the meeting notes for anybody who wants to add or change anything. And with that, let me jump right in. So V1.1, if we really are still working on it, this is top of mind. If your PR is related in any way to 1.1, please don't hesitate to ping on Slack anywhere. My goal is to make sure that anything related to 1.1 is getting a review the same day it either came in, changed, whatever, because really want to make sure these get out as soon as possible. And the good news is we're getting on track. We have a lot of things that are either complete or on track. gRPC route, we're on our final stages. So we need rebase and then LGTM for this final thing, which actually graduates the types. The rest are good. I just want to remind everyone here that the current proposal is, as I propose specifically, is to serve, but not serve V1 Alpha 2 in standard channel. So that means although you can install standard CRDs, like standard gRPC route on top of experimental, it means that you're going to have to stop using V1 Alpha 2 in your manifest. So if you're, as an end user, that means that you would have to update all your manifests to say V1, otherwise you get an error next time your CI or whatever ran. And then similarly for controllers, this would unfortunately have the impact of breaking controllers that were not updated to know anything about V1 before the CRDs were upgraded in a cluster. So that is decidedly not great, but it is, I think, the least bad of the options available to us. At least that's my current take. And the rationale for that, well, there's a lot of discussion actually in this PR, but the rationale for this idea is that exposing alpha in our standard channel, our kind of stable API, means that at some point in the future, we need to have some kind of deprecation or pain in standard channel. And the whole idea of standard channel is to avoid pain. So if you only ever install standard channel CRDs, you should never have to deal with any deprecations, any kind of pain like that. And so this is with that in mind, though it does cause some level of pain for people that are trying to upgrade from experimental to standard. Yeah, that's all I've got on this one. Next up is parent ref port. This is complete. Thank you to Frank for making this a reality. Everything is good to go on this one. Same for conformance profiles. Mattia got all the PRs in for this one, so we are good. Then next up, the TLS terminology gap. That's complete, merged, good to go. This was an unexpected one, but John added kind of a bit from an old gap that had been previously approved. Parameters ref and infrastructure, gateway infrastructure, that merged, had unanimous approval. And so we're moving forward from that. That was based on discussion at last week's Gateway API community meeting, and realized that maybe gateway class parameters ref isn't sufficient, and this had been previously approved in a previous GEP, so it made sense to try and squeeze it into 1.1. And don't know if Arco's on this call. Yeah, he's in a different time zone right now. But the other thing is client cert validation, which the GEP is merged, approved, good to go. The only thing that's missing here is this final step to actually update this PR with the changes that were in the approved GEP. But this one's awfully close. Session persistence, Grant, maybe you can provide not to put you on the spot or anything, but I know we're just chatting in Slack about what's next here, but I think we're close to on track with this one.
Yeah, I just had a PR. Last week we talked about naming, and I had a PR that was relevant to that talked about the background and sort of the methods to the names that we picked, and then also a survey of all the names that just merged. So that's in the GEP now. Gina's got a PR that's open right now. I had one comment on it. I think that we need to follow up one, but other than that, I think we're good. My only concern here is, the API changed recently because we made some tweaks. I hope it's had enough review as far as like the actual API structure goes. That would be my only concern is I don't think I got a whole lot of comments on I know I got comments on like the GEP itself, but I'm just curious if maybe it's worth for a couple more eyes on the API structure. Otherwise, I mean, I think we're good to go as far as experimental. I don't think we're ever going to have it 100% flushed out. There's always going to be an edge case that's going to pop up, and I think we have to kind of cut it at some point and get people trying it out.
Yeah, a big plus one on everything you said. I think that you have done tremendous work on this. I know we've gone through a million different iterations now. I think that what we have is pretty good. I'm obviously biased here, but I would encourage. I think that's a good call out if anybody does have time or cycles to take one last look at the API. This is, really the next two days or so are your opportunity. Otherwise, we will plan on releasing it as experimental. And as we're seeing, experimental does still leave room for change, but it is something that we're reasonably confident in, and I think this at least meets that bar. Um, so yeah, thanks for pushing this forward. Um, don't hesitate to ping me for any follow-up PRs that need to get in. I think it really is just the API spec at this point. Once Gina's gets in, and should be good on this one. So cool. Any comments, thoughts, concerns on this area on 1.1 before I move on? Cool. All right. Dave, I think you're on the call. I can't tell, but I know
And
you've got a few more conformance tests that you're looking to get in, right?
I kind of categorize most of them. So the
Okay.
first two here, because there's Golang or Gomod changes or Golang CI YAML changes, they actually need leads to actually approve rather than conformance owners. So for the most part, I think people have approved it. There's a handful of people who have approved it or LGTM'd it.
Okay.
So I'll take a
Yeah,
look.
no, this seems like good coverage. And the other one, so these can be on myself and Shane. And then the other one is, oh yeah, they're in the, why did anything change in Go mod for the weighted one?
I use Air Group, which is an Xsync package. So I think it went from like, yeah.
Oh, got it. Okay. Okay, makes sense. Yeah, thanks for getting these in. And then it looks like you need some review from other conformance owners, etc., or just review it all on some of these. Um,
Yeah.
okay. We really are trying to cut RC1 ASAP to kind of jump back up here, trying to get to feature completion this week. So ideally that means changelog and feature completion means everything is merged, and then RC1 ASAP immediately after that. So that means as much as possible, if you can work towards things that are related to 1.1, these definitely meet that bar, in my opinion. But once we cut RC1, I think we'll be a lot more hesitant to add additional conformance tests or certainly additional features. So that means this week is a big week for things getting in. So if you can spare any review cycles, I think a lot of these PRs are pretty good and great to have more conformance coverage. So just encourage you to take a look. Yeah, cool. The next one is backend TLS policy. This is kind of a follow-up from the TLS memorandum gap and ARCO's gap for client cert validation. A couple of changes that are being proposed. One, backend TLS policy.spec.tls turns into .validation to be more consistent with what we imagine will exist in the rest of the API. And then spelling out CA certificate refs instead of CA cert refs to be more consistent with our terminology in the other parts of the API. And unfortunately, that means a bump of version from Alpha 2 to Alpha 3. I think all of those changes are relatively straightforward, but they are going to be breaking. It's been quite a while since we've had a breaking change in experimental channel. But hopefully this is all worthwhile in the goal of having more consistent TLS terminology. Candace, I think you said you would have time to work on that this week. Is that correct?
Yeah, I can take a look at that.
Sweet. Thank you. Thank you for owning this all the way through. And I'm excited to get this one across the line in not too long too. The very last thing that I have related to 1.1 is it would be great, as John mentioned in Slack this morning, for us to have some kind of Kubernetes blog post like we've done in the past for the 1.1 release. A reminder that Kubernetes website, Kubernetes docs folks really want us to give around 2 weeks advance notice for any blog post, which really means we should be working on a draft this week. I don't want to volunteer anyone, but I would love, if there's somebody that's been working on any one of these features that we'd want to cover, basically anything in the list above that we'd want to cover in a v1.1 blog post. If you have some cycles to help organize this, find people who can help you write this blog post, I think that would be a huge win. And I do want to, make sure that we get some new people or, fresh faces that are getting to represent Gateway API on the Kubernetes blog. So don't need to volunteer anyone in this specific meeting, but, if you have any interest in this, please ping on Slack afterwards. Would be great to have some kind of representation on the Kubernetes blog for this release. All right. I've got a can of worms one, but before I get to my can of worms, maybe Grant, you can go first because this feels like a bit less of a can of worms.
Yeah, sure. This might be like an off the wall question, but just shoot me down if it doesn't make any sense. But someone mentioned today to me that I guess when they design APIs, they use sort of a what do you
Did
call
my
it?
audio cut out, or is it just
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Rob, you look frozen,
You're-
so maybe your audio cut out.
Yeah, it's mine. Sorry. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, so they use a reference implementation, I guess, as far as their driving API changes. I don't know if they meant that they drive every new feature into their reference implementation. I think that's what they meant, but I was curious, does that does that make any sense here? So like maybe taking session persistence as a case, would it be crazy to say using Blix to add the session persistence API to have sort of a concrete example for how session persistence should work? Is that crazy talk, or what do you think?
So no, it's not crazy talk. So this has been actually a fairly controversial topic, but so far in the history of Gateway API, we've shunned the idea of a reference implementation. Which I know sounds strange because Bleakst does exist, but Bleakst was primarily to solve the gap that existed at L4. And Shane, I think you're on the call, so you can correct
Oh,
any of what I'm
yes.
saying here. Yeah, yeah. Shane, why don't you cover this one because you're the expert here.
It is not out of the question for Blix to eventually become something that resembles a reference implementation. We did kind of go for that at one point. And the way in which we protected it basically made it safe to do so, because in the past we did not want to do a reference implementation for worries of looking like we favored anything. And to be honest, because we already had kind of the problem with like Nginx ingress or ingress Nginx in Kubernetes, where it's like that's just kind of the default place that where everybody goes, and it's kind of the endorsed place. We didn't want to duplicate that for Gateway API. That said, we literally have code in Blix that you cannot use it outside of a specific environment, and we've kind of agreed that if we ever got to the point where you could use it outside of that specific environment, we would. There's like something on here that like basically says like we talked about like putting a timer that kills the thing. Like we want to desperately stop this from ever being used in production. So it's still potentially viable for it to head down there. But realistically, what's happened, and this project is still pretty active, is that it's become more of a sandbox for people that want to learn specific technologies, networking, Gateway API, Rust, eBPF. It's become more of a fun project. We are still actively working on the layer 4 stuff, however. So we have the conformance tests for UDP that were just put in by, I forget his name, but I met him in Paris. We're putting those in to Blix so that we can be one of the conformant implementations that has a report. So in that way, we're still kind of moving forward with like the help of Gateway API. I think I'm saying too much at this point, but suffice to say, like it has kind of gone more into like this is a for fun project that we meet up and like, do more because we just enjoy the technology than a reference implementation at this point. But it's still on the table to head that way if you wanted to push for it.
Yeah, and I think I think that's a good perspective. I would just go ahead and add that with L7, we've been really fortunate in Gateway API that we have a lot of very good quality implementations that are very quick to adopt and implement our experimental features. So our goal has always been to have at least 3 implementations support a feature before it moves on to standard. And so far, we haven't had an issue with that. If in the future, for L7, to be clear, and if in the future that changes, I think that may be a case where we need to experiment with this a bit more. But I would say that we're very much not trying to compete with everyone that's trying to implement this API. We don't want to take away from any of their business with like a standard approach. That's not in the interest of this project.
Yes, that's the big thing.
So even if we did have a reference implementation here, it would still have all the same guardrails of do not use in production, auto shutdown, something, right? Like that is very much against the goal of our project. But so far L7 has not been a problem. L4, on the other hand, we've really struggled to get early buy-in usage implementation of the L4 set of APIs, and Bleaks has been a huge help there. And so that's kind of been the differentiator where if we're really having trouble getting buy-in and implementation, this can kind of help. With that, I expect with something like session persistence, there's going to be a lot of implementations pretty early on. I hope I'm right there, but we'll see pretty soon.
I think it might just a little bit of extra context because I think it matters a little bit. Blixt soon is heading in a direction where it will be entirely written in Rust. It was traditionally the data plane was written in Rust using Linux and eBPF because we felt that that was non spicy. Like, you know, it's not a it's not picking an implementation of like an L7 proxy, which was much more spicy. We're just using Linux. Everybody uses Linux, so that should be fine. So I think naturally it might end up becoming a reference implementation for Rust-based gateway API implementations. But for Go ones, it wouldn't necessarily be bad to have that as well. Again, as long as we put it behind this guardrail of like, as a project, Gateway API, we are committed to never having a production usable reference implementation.
Yeah, +1. And agree with what Costin's saying too, that his comment in chat that there's a big risk of reference implementations. You know, plenty of APIs just won't scale. Like they can theoretically work in a reference implementation, but they can't work in production, for example, or at scale. And so I think it's important to have non-reference implementations of an API before we move forward with anything.
Maybe in the future with Blixt, what we can do is have AI determine if you're trying to use it in production. If it does, it goes and pulls an exploit off of GitHub to get root on your host and rm-rfs the whole thing. That would be a pretty good deterrence, I think, against using it in production.
Brilliant. I mean, we've been needing to sprinkle some AI onto Gateway somewhere, so
Right.
well
AI
just,
and Kubernetes SIGs, it's time. He says, let's not joke about this. That was his response to that.
Oh man. Okay. Cool.
No, you're
So
right,
just
Costin, it is a big risk.
yes, yeah. I agree. So with that said, yeah, thank you for raising that, Grant. It is a good question. And maybe we take away from this is we should probably have some kind of documentation somewhere that just summarizes what we just said, because I don't think we've spelled it out quite as clearly anywhere written down, at least in the Gateway API context. I don't know, but yeah. Cool. Okay, so can of worms time, if we're good with that. I think several of you, maybe many of you, have seen my very unpopular idea to split experimental CRDs into separate API groups and names. And what I want you to take away from this is that we, as a project, in my opinion, are facing a significant risk to our versioning strategy. And people, end users, are going to be frustrated if we continue down our current path. That's what I would say. So in my take, gRPC route, you know, as I was thinking about gRPC route and what we were going to do with it, graduate it to GA, whatever, it became abundantly clear to me that we have bigger problems with our versioning. And I take full responsibility for those because I'm largely responsible for the versioning plan and guidelines that we have today. So this is me telling myself and everyone else that the thing that I proposed originally is broken in a variety of ways, and I would like to fix it. So with that little bit of background, let me jump in and say that one of the problems that has become very clear is there's no safe path from experimental back to standard channel. And I can't find a way to get that. So to give you an idea, if you have let's say somebody in your cluster decided to upgrade HTTP route to experimental channel because they really wanted some new feature. They have no safe path to go from experimental channel back to standard without dropping fields, losing data, a variety of painful things. And if there were legitimate production uses of HTTP route in your cluster, you've really put yourself in a painful position of, you know, upgrading a CRD to experimental for one use case somewhere, maybe in development, maybe, I don't know, hopefully you're not using experimental in production, but you've affected everything in your cluster. And that's really painful, in my opinion. So that has led me to the idea that maybe experimental and standard channels should actually be more isolated from each other so they can coexist in the same cluster. So that idea is that they could have different API groups and or names. So it's very clear that you're using experimental resources, and that if somebody tries to use an experimental resource in a cluster that already has production gateway API usage, you're not doing anything to impact that production gateway API usage. This is more of an additional feature that's on the side, right? It allows you to experiment without interfering with your production usage of an API. So this also comes in the world where I expect that more and more cluster providers, provisioners, managed operators, etc., are going to start including Gateway API by default. Remember that now that this is a GA API, the last couple of KubeCons, I've seen a lot of discussion about when and how other providers should start including these CRDs when clusters are created because, well, they're GA. And so if we're not careful, we also risk experimental APIs becoming inaccessible to the vast majority of users and recreating the very same problems that we've experienced with upstream Kubernetes APIs unnecessarily in this case. So that's my starting point for why I'm proposing this. I do want to say this is not in scope for v1.1, but it is very much related to what we're doing in v1.1, and I wanted to start the discussion relatively early because I do want to include something related to this, some kind of solution for these problems in 1.2. Yeah, so I've talked a lot. Costin has a hand. What are you thinking?
I mean, why do you think it's controversial? I mean, is anyone pushing back against it, or what's? I mean,
Yes.
it seems straightforward. How Kubernetes is supposed to work. You create a resource, you do whatever you want with it, and if you want to put it in a different group, you create a different resource. And the other comment I have is we actually discussed about the same thing in Istio TOCs this morning, with very similar arguments. That's why I don't think it's very controversial, because it seems that everyone is kind of violently agreeing with this. The main thing I want to kind of refine a bit the idea is to maybe allow multiple experimental group, multiple groups where this kind of stuff can happen, and not call it experimental, because it's really a CRT that it's developed independently that may not have a long life, but like a vendor API is not necessary that everything will live forever in Kubernetes namespace v1. And treat it a bit more like it's just an API that is developed independently, different vendors adopted, not adopted. And then if it's mature enough, we make a subset or exactly the same thing or whatever part of the v1 Kubernetes, promote it basically. But I would not call it experimental. If telemetry defines some API, we implement it and maybe we move it into Kubernetes as a first class, forever live v1.
Yeah, so that's a potential use case I had not thought of here, but that is an interesting extension of how you could use this. And I'm glad to hear that not everyone is against this idea. It sounds like there's at least some support. Maybe someone on the call who is less supportive. I think, Dave, you've had some concerns. I don't know if others are on the call that have concerns. If anyone has concerns and wants to voice them, this is a good opportunity.
Looks
Well,
like
I'm gonna
the crowd has voted.
I'm gonna take this as well, perfect. Everyone loves it, and we can move on without question. But more seriously, I will continue to respond. I've had long conversations with John and Flynn, kind of async, about this specific pattern. The big deal is that this does result in some level of pain for controllers. My working theory was that the level of pain was manageable, so I included a really basic POC in here. But John fairly linked to an example where they actually did something similar in Istio, as a temporary workaround for some of their stuff, and it was decidedly not simple for them. So it is, you know, very, very worth getting some controller authors to provide some additional feedback here. Yeah, but I also don't want this to be completely overrun with only controller authors. I'd love to get anyone who's actually using this API and could potentially run into the pain points of experimental to provide feedback as well. Because what I'm very concerned about here is that, you know, as usage of this API grows, that someone somewhere is going to get trapped in experimental and not have a way out. And we can just document, oh, you can just never use experimental because you can never, but that's not great. The other thing is, you know, maybe a bunch of managed providers start effectively limiting the use of experimental, not intentionally, but just by installing the GA APIs, and there's no way to install experimental because the GA ones are already managed and kind of forced on. Yeah, so I think this is not a problem that is, you know, for tomorrow, but it's a problem that is definitely on the horizon, and we should be thinking about solutions over the next few months so we can have a real solution in place for 1.2. Obviously, I have my proposal, and that's here. But if anyone has a better proposal, a different proposal, I'd love to hear it. Just looking for ways to provide a better option than the trajectory that we're currently on. And I do want to call out, you know, I wish Shane, sorry, Flynn was here for this one, but I had a long back and forth discussion with Flynn, and he spent a lot of time writing up everything about versioning from his perspective, and I think it's great. He has an entire doc and specifically what the API server will not do. Oh, yeah, maybe is my audio flaking on people? I don't
Cut
know.
out just for a second.
Okay, cool. Hopefully I'm back now. But yeah. So yeah, with that, I just want to call out that Flynn has done some excellent work here. I know he's still continuing to work and edit this, but he's given a pretty good summary of the current state and the deceiving things about versioning in Kubernetes. Like you would think, I've had a couple people suggest, well, maybe storage version could solve this for us, and unfortunately, it doesn't do what you would think it does, and it doesn't really offer a solution that I can think of. And so Flynn does a great job at kind of documenting the limitations of the options available to us. That's what I would say. And he even has a demo because, of course, he does. So that's fun. Yeah, that's all I've got on this one. This is not 1.1 blocker, but it is very much relevant because we're going to continue to run into versioning pain and problems until we deal with this, I think. Any last comments on this? Cool. All right. Well, I think that's everything I've got for meeting today. I think we've reached the end of the agenda with time to spare. So thanks, everyone. Hopefully we'll have everything in this week. And yeah, please don't hesitate to ping me if you're interested in working on a blog post for 1.1. And with that, thanks, everyone. See you.